Welcome. Today we are talking about the publishing process of short stories in an anthology from submission all the way through that magic huzzah, it's up. And so first, I'm Kiersten, Marcil, author and adventurer into history. I write the Revolutionary War fantasy series, The Enlightened Saga, and I'm here with the publisher.
And I'm Josh Bellin. You can call me Josh. You can call me Joshua. I publish under Joshua David Bellin, but most friends call me Josh. And yeah, I've self-published. I've traditionally published, and as you can see behind me, the three volumes of the Accidental Time Travelers Collective from Volume 1 to Volume 3 are among my most recent and most prized self-publications.
And I am the editor for those three volumes. So Josh and I recently hosted a gathering of accidental time travelers where we met with about a dozen of those authors and talked about the volume. It was a party, it was a kickoff, but what came out of that was someone wanted to know about the publishing process. So we're here to fill in that gap for everyone. And I'll put a link below to the gathering so you can find it. So Josh, maybe for people who are finding this video first, what is the Accidental Time Travelers Collective and where did it come from?
So it's three volumes at the moment. It started back in 2022, and then there was a volume in 23, and then there was a volume in 24. Each time we published on Pretend That You're a Time Traveler Day, which is actually a thing, December 8th every year. It arose really from the platform, the social media platform that shall not be named, where a bunch of people who were interested in time travel met, writing time travel and reading time travel, met through Julie Bin, who was our founder. She developed a hashtag called Time Travel Authors, which is still active on lots of other social media programs, including Mastodon, Blue Sky, and so forth. And we sort of found each other that way. I was publishing Myriad, my time travel novel right there, was just about to come out. And so I was like, great, there's other time travel authors on this social media platform. So let's get together. And we talked. There were daily prompts. It was a lot of fun. And then I just had this idea because we had all met, Kiersten was one of the members and lots of others. I said, well, what about if we put together a volume of short stories, a little anthology? And one of the members came up with the title, The Accidental Time Travelers Collective, which we thought was pretty cool, ATTC, as we sometimes abbreviate it. And so that's how it came about. And we decided rather than shopping it around, going through the traditional publication route, we would just publish it ourselves.
So Josh, I'm curious, had you been involved before Accidental Time Travelers Collective with self-publishing or with doing an anthology?
So I've had prior to that point I had a story or two published in anthologies. I think two or three actually, now that I think of it. So I was sort of familiar with the idea of anthologies, but I never attempted to self-publish an anthology. I had done some self-publishing of my own individual works. Notably, I have a 5-book series called The Ecosystem Cycle. I call it the cycle. Originally, it was the trilogy, then it grew to 5 books. So I thought cycle sounded cool. So that was fun. But what I did with that one, a lot of the work I didn't do myself through a friend who had done some self-publishing. She recommended a book designer, cover designer. They really kind of did everything in terms of creating not only the cover design, but the interior design. At that point, I was relatively new to this. I was completely new to the process. So I wanted to sort of hand all of the design work off to somebody else. So yeah, that was my experience with self-publishing prior to becoming involved with the Accidental Time Travelers.
Okay, and so our submission process changed through the 3 volumes. Do you want to walk our listeners into how we started?
Yeah, the way we started was since we had just found each other and we were friends, social media friends, and just decided we were going to take anybody who was in that core group who submitted a story and assuming that it wasn't absolutely horrible, and none of the submissions were. In fact, they were all quite good.
Yeah.
We ended up with 12. I don't really recall how we ended up with 12. It's a nice number. I think that's everybody who submitted, but in any event, 12 ended up being a good number for an anthology. So we just those were the people who were members of the anthology. We didn't put out a call for submissions or anything else, which we ultimately did as we tried to broaden the reach of the group, broaden the number of authors who could be represented in it, and also maybe professionalize a little bit. The first one I almost think of as just like it was our little pet project.
Yeah.
It's a great group of stories. I think it's every single story in there is really strong, but it was just something that we did because we were having fun and we were friends and we thought it would be a fun thing to do.
Yeah. And then I forget how the second submission process worked because I wasn't part of that. I took over the submission process for the third volume. And that was one where, like you, I kind of delegated. I handled the administrative aspects of it, but I had three readers who read. And I get the feeling that that's kind of how volume two worked as well, right? That other people read and then
Yeah.
sent you their thoughts.
Yeah, that's what happened. Volume two was maybe a middle ground between the first one and the third one. The third one, we put out an official call for submissions. It was kind of open to anyone. The second one, we tried to bring in other people who were using the time travel authors hashtag, who maybe were not part of the core group. The group had originally found each other and that had been involved in the first volume. But so we reached out to some people. It was sort of by invitation is the way
Yeah.
we did that second one. So it still was, and those stories were vetted. And we did, in the case of the first volume, every story that was submitted was accepted. In the case of the second, not so, because there were a couple of stories that once we had gotten readers' reports, and the readers being members of the ATTC group,
Mhm.
I would get two readers to take a look at things, reading anonymously, which I think is important so that you're
Yeah.
not biased by any particular feeling you might have about a person. But there were a couple of the submissions that we decided weren't quite right for the volume, so we did have a little bit more formal acceptance rejection policy. But still, as I said, it was we were reaching out to people and inviting them to submit, as opposed to what we would do with the third volume where we had the open call. So it transitioned, it developed. Um, I think all of the volumes are super strong. It's
Yeah.
quite possible that the third is the strongest because of having done the open submission call.
Yeah, because we did get more submissions than 12, and I ran it the way a trad publisher would. I sent out R&Rs, revise and resubmits, to people where I thought this story had potential, but I wanted to know if the authors were committed to working with me as an editor. And so people got,
Yeah.
either came back or they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I do think that that process was very useful. We had a number of authors who were first getting their first story published
Mm-hmm.
in each of the volumes. We had authors who this was going to be their first published story, and so I think working with an editor and in some cases making pretty substantial revisions at your request. Well, and necessary revisions. And I like that as somebody who has mostly published traditionally. I personally love the interaction between author and editor. I
Yeah.
think it's critical to producing quality work. So I think that really worked out well.
And it's funny too, because my role changed also through the three volumes. Because if I remember correctly, you brought me in just as a copy editor, which for people who don't know what that is, that's just the basic. I pull out the grammar book and I say, oh, there's a comma missing or a word missing, and it's just the nitty gritty. But even with that first volume, I think I started doing a little bit of content. It was really second volume and then third volume that grew into
Right, you did.
the full scope.
Yeah, and that's probably a good time for you to talk about your editing process and how it changed, what you did and then how that process changed over time. Because you're right, it was initially just, well, let's tidy up these stories a little bit, uh, dot the I's and cross the T's, but the role expanded in that volume and expanded significantly as it went on. So if you want to talk about that, that would be great.
Yeah, so in terms of like just the copy editing, which I did do for all three, even though I did more with the content, the substance of the stories, it was always, Chicago Manual style was our grammar choice because that's what the industry uses, Merriam-Webster dictionary. We had the fun privilege of getting to work with international authors. So I really liked that you had made the decision and we stuck by it for all three, where we kept the spelling of the author's home country, So
Mhm.
that way we were keeping their voice as much as possible. And it was only really the grammar that needed to stay consistent through the whole thing. Um, in terms of, I know you wanted to talk about like scheduling, when you sent me stories, or once the reading panel by the third volume has sent me stories and we contracted with people, everybody got a schedule ahead of time. They had a calendar. They knew what their deadlines were going to be. They didn't know when they were going to get their story from me for editing. And it did end up being a very tight turnaround this last volume, but everybody was super on their game, which was so awesome. Um, but really, for the editing process, I, especially by the third volume, I think my way in approaching these authors changed as well. Is I edit through the way I would beta read. I'd ask questions. I'd be like, "Hey, this is the crux of your story, but you're missing stuff. What about this? What was she feeling? What was she doing? What was going on around this character?" And worked with people that way. We had two deadlines with a third possible round for any authors who needed additional work.
Mhm.
But it really was, particularly by the end, I tried to make it more of a give and take. So it really did feel like what a good editor author relationship should be, which is a partnership in creating the best story possible. And so a lot of times too with the grammar rules, because authors just hate that.
Authors are authors,
Authors,
authors
yeah,
sometimes
we
have trouble
create,
letting go of their words and of accepting an editor's feedback. Yeah, that's
yeah.
one thing I was going to ask you, whether you thought overall the process worked, what you learned throughout the process of the three volumes,
Mm.
what you would keep the same, what you would change. I think those are interesting questions from an editor's perspective.
I definitely learned through the three-volume process again to stop making suggestions and to put it through the guise of questioning the author, and not in a why did you do this, but really just just prompt them as much as I could. And then when we did hit stuff where there is, again, particularly the grammar, there might be some kickback. I said, okay, this is not how the rule works, but here we have options. You tell me which one is most comfortable. And
Mhm.
I found that really worked for everybody. It just made it a smoother, more pleasant process.
So, is there anything that you would do differently? If you had to do it again, anything that you would change in the process going forward?
Yeah, don't think I didn't catch that whole we were maybe done with three.
Maybe.
Who knows, right?
I mean, a trilogy seems nice, but a quadrilogy or a pentology or whatever, I don't
Yeah,
even
you never
call these
know.
things. Yeah,
I think the biggest thing that I would change, Josh, would be just more time.
yeah, yeah,
Ironic.
yeah.
But there's a reason why traditional publishing with the big publishers takes years. We did this very fast, which
Mhm.
is fine because it kept everybody, while they could work on this project, go do what you needed to do next. But I would have liked a longer um, just chance to work on it because, you work full time, I work full time. So like many authors, and this is done nights and weekends for me, and so that's
Right.
like every night and weekend for 3 months is spent working with authors.
Yeah, I felt that same way too. I mean, I think you did a great job of keeping us on track and having clear expectations and deadlines. But even though we kept thinking that we were giving ourselves enough time, it did seem a little rushed, especially as it got down to the end, because there were a lot of things that I had to do on my side that, needed some time on the publisher's side. So, what about was it fun? I mean, were there great things about doing the editing? Were there less great things about doing the editing that you want to talk about?
Oh, it's always fun. It's always great. And you had touched on this too. It's really exciting when you take an author's story, particularly with a new author. This is their first time, they're excited, and you help them discover the best way to tell their story, to watch it grow, to watch it blossom. There's one author in particular from our third volume who her story just grew so much from that beginning. And there were recommendations not to take it, but there was such a good story there that just needed somebody to love it as much as the author did. And I am so proud of that author because she's getting so many good reviews in, in where we're published, and it
Yeah.
just makes my heart swell.
It's great, and I know which author you're talking about, obviously, and the story got much longer. It was fairly short at the, and that was one of the things I remember the feedback, because I was always copied on the feedback.
Mhm.
One of the things that you were suggesting that the author needed to do was fill in the gaps and sort of get more into the story, more description, lots of other things. And you're right, it really became. I mean, it was a brilliant idea to start, but it was more like a sketch.
Yes.
And then it became a fully developed story, and it's wonderful to see. And it's one of the strongest stories in the collection.
It really is. She really took, and that's a great author editor relationship right there, because she was so open, and just her imagination, her skills, just everything, just took the story and ran with it,
Right.
and it's so good. Yeah.
So, if you were to, as an editor who has now gone through this process, if you were to give advice to people who want to do the same thing, who want to be editors,
Mm,
what would you tell them?
such a hard question, because I I think it helps because I did start as a copy editor, and then informally started beta reading, which is where somebody gives you their story. It's as done as they can get it. And you just read it and tell them what you think. And I
Mhm.
really learned how to be a content editor. I forget what the industry calls it. I always think of it as content, where you look at the meat of the story.
Or like developmental editing,
Developmental.
whatever.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you. That's the
yeah,
word I needed.
yeah.
So, but that I think is the way to start. Like the copy editing, you just gotta memorize the Chicago manual style, and I did that. I edited in academia and learned it that way. But for the developmental editing, it really was just doing favors for other authors to start with, and then moving into starting to accept payment for my work.
Yeah, and one thing that I think that you and I would probably both agree on is that if you're going to traditionally published work, you're going to have the assistance of an editor, sometimes agents. If you're working with an agent, will be editorial. They'll help you polish the manuscript before they are ready to start sending it out. And then certainly if it gets accepted for publication, you're going to be working with a succession of editors. There's going to be a developmental editing phase. There's going to be a line editing phase. There's going to be a copy editing phase. And those are not always the same. Typically, they're not the same people. So there's a lengthy editorial process. But even if you're self-publishing, I think you and I would both agree you should work with an editor.
You absolutely should not edit for yourself. Again, I think it's one thing to copy edit your
Yeah.
own work, to pull down the Chicago manual. I keep pointing because it's right there above my head.
I wondered what you were pointing at.
That's why I could literally reach and grab it. It's always in hand's reach. That I think you can do yourself once it's gone through everything else, to do
Mhm.
that last edit. And because at least if you're someone like me, um, I don't change anything unless I can point to the rule and I know the exact number and subsection. But like you were saying, I would never advise, never do it myself, edit my own work. And in fact, because I had two short stories, you were my editor. And obviously, vice versa, I edited all of yours. And it's because you need that outside objective view of what works,
Right.
that you
Right.
just can't do
I
yourself.
agree. And I think that I mean, I can speak about my own stories and the feedback that you gave me and made some really brilliant suggestions with all three of them that fundamentally, especially I think it was in the case of the first, where there was one scene that just wasn't working and
Yeah.
it was making the main character very unlikable in ways that I didn't want, and
Yeah.
we talked about it, and you again, it was a good process. It wasn't like you said you
Yep.
must do X. You
Mhm.
did it more in the sort of encouraging and questioning way. As a reader, I'm not really seeing it this way. This isn't really working. Can you do something else? And so then I went back to the drawing board and rewrote the scene, and it really fundamentally changed the story. So, I think that that's a good process, and it's nice to have that kind of openness and that kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Just kind of uh uh both mutual
Communication.
respect with
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
editor, right?
Yeah.
You're each you're not neither of you is sort of digging your heels in. You're both
Mhm.
working together. Yeah,
Yeah.
productively.
And actually, your story from the first volume is a really good example because not that people saw the process other than you and me, but it is a good example because it's a good story. It's a great story. And you were delving into some really rich, deep character development arc that is hard to do, quite frankly. And so,
Right. Especially in
yeah,
a short story. It's one thing in a novel, you've got a lot of space to develop your character. In a short story, you've got, 3 to 5,000 words or thereabouts. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah,
Awesome.
let's see. What was what was the process in your end by the end?
Okay, so once I got it, you mean once I got everything back from you, basically, and then it was a question of getting it in shape to be put up on various
Sites.
platforms that could
Yeah.
sell it. Yeah. So okay, that's where one of the places where I think we ran into a time crunch because it does
Mhm.
take a while. I think that some people may have the idea that indie publishing, self-publishing is instantaneous. You have your manuscript, you throw it at Amazon or Draft to Digital or one of these places that does it, and then boom, instantly it's there. But it's not there. It's not that quick.
Right.
There is, first of all, the question of formatting the entire manuscript in order to get it into shape into the file format and into the with certain wrinkles that are necessary. For example, so that on Kindle you can jump immediately from chapter to chapter or story to story. There are formatting things that you have to do to make that work. The system doesn't just do it for you. If you don't submit the manuscript that has those formatting, I guess, probably commands in place, then it's not going to work. So there's a number of things, and those are things that I learned because, as I said, with the ecosystem novels, I just let somebody else do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just said I don't know anything about this, so prepare in that case PDFs or Word documents or whatever. Somebody else was doing it,
Mm-hmm.
and then I was literally able just to upload those things on my end, and then everything kind of worked, although occasionally it doesn't even work, right? There will be weird
Yeah.
things. Even though I had professionals doing it, sometimes let's say the sizing wasn't quite right, the
Mm-hmm.
bleed, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's such a thing as bleed where, where does the image fit on the page and does it go right up to the edge of the page or not? And
Right.
sometimes if it's not sized perfectly, there will be problems with that. And I did experience that with even some of the stuff that was professionally done. Either I had given them the wrong specifications or something happened, and I would upload it, and then I would get this error message, that it wasn't working and that it wasn't fitting.
Yeah.
Once I'd gotten used to those issues, we
Right.
were, I think, throughout the 3 volumes, we were much more careful when we were formatting for the Kindle, or let's just say ebook version. It's typically a Word document that you can upload. For the paperback version, it's typically a PDF. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to have those two different versions for the two different formats of books. I think we were pretty good at doing that. Uh, for the third one, you were the one who actually formatted the Word document, and it was fine. I could just put it there and run with it. With the PDF, we actually had Julie, who, as I mentioned at the start of this, she was our founding mother, I guess,
Yeah.
who actually gave us the hashtag and who planted the idea in my mind. She also had Vellum. Is it
I
called
think it's
Vellum?
Vellum she uses.
Vellum. Yeah, I get Vellum and Kindle Vella confused, but that doesn't exist anymore. So I guess I should get it right. They just discontinued it.
Yeah.
But yes, Vellum. So she would use that to format, and it is a formatting program that creates a publishing ready PDF. And that was nice. So the interiors were done by Julie for the PDFs. We also had to get covers. None of us were probably the quality of artists who were going to be doing our own covers. Some of us
Yeah.
have some design background and experience. That's
Right.
not uncommon with authors, but we weren't going to be making these really awesome covers like
Yeah.
we have right here, right?
Yeah.
So we did use a cover service. We used Get Covers. That's the name of them, getcovers.com. They were fairly inexpensive. Some cover designers are very expensive, talking $1,000 for a cover or something. And a lot of indie authors obviously don't want to get into that kind of expense, but there are other options. And we were satisfied with Get covers. Not only were they good, but they were very responsive. They were willing to make lots of changes, especially with the second volume, the one in the middle there, the blue
Mm-hmm.
one. We had trouble. It's a city background, and we had trouble integrating the figure with the city. So
Oh.
it just round after round of revision. I just kept going back to them. Hey, could you do this? Could you do that? And they were very willing to make any change. They didn't have a limit. Some cover designers will like have a limit. You get 2 revisions or something. With Get covers, there was no limit. They just made the changes until we were satisfied. But of course, that extended the process. And that was
Right.
one of the reasons that we started to feel a time crunch at the end. I was trying
Mm-hmm.
to time it so I would get these covers and various other things in plenty of time for the upload phase, but it didn't always work out that way.
Right. And maybe for our audience too, because I work very closely with my publisher on my book series, I have learned that just because you upload something to one of the distributors, they go through their own process of looking at it, making sure, like you said, the coding kind of works right. And you
Right.
won't always get an answer until maybe a week later, depending on how many people are trying to publish at that time, whether or not your volume even has gone through properly.
Yeah, that's right. And since we were trying to have a pre-order period of roughly a month with each of the volumes, which you can do, Amazon does that with ebooks. I think maybe they've started to do it with print books. I wouldn't swear to that, but either way, we did have a pre-order period, roughly a month. But what that meant was if the book's coming out on December 8th, we had to have it ready. Well, we had to have it ready by December 8th because you can put it on pre-order before everything is fixed, but you kind of don't want that pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because then you're like, if let's just say worst case scenario, you say that it's going to go for sale on December 8th. You put it up for pre-order on November 8th,
Yeah.
and then by December 4th, they need a few days beforehand to make sure everything's ready before it can go. Maybe by December 4th, things aren't ready. Well, people have already pre-ordered it. And then
Right.
if you miss the pre-order deadline, then people are annoyed, understandably so. So, there are lots of things that you have to think about, both on your end and on the end of whatever platform you're publishing it on.
Right. And some of those platforms too, where if you miss a publication date after you have run a pre-order, they will ban you from doing
Yeah.
that again.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because you're unreliable, and it's bad for them as well as it's bad for you, right? Because
right.
they don't want to have a product there that they've promised their readers is going to be available and then it's not available. So yeah,
Right.
there's a lot of things to take into account, and there's a lot of moving pieces, I think, especially with an anthology, right? If it's just
Yeah.
your own work, you're the one who's working on it. With ours, there was the editing that you did of all the individual pieces. There was the
Right.
making sure that everything was ready on time, so far as that went, but then getting the actual full manuscript pulled together, having that timed in such a way that we could get it uploaded and vetted by the publisher in time for it to go live. So yeah, a lot of things that you have to have a calendar and be
Mhm.
very mindful of what the deadlines are.
Right. And I think too, a piece of advice for people who are looking at this and thinking about publishing for the first time, you definitely don't want to be last minute either, because if you know you're going to do a print edition, you have the option of ordering a copy ahead of time. It gets a nice little band slapped on it that says not for sale, which I love because when I go to book events and I sell, that's what I put on the table for people to handle because I don't care if that one gets damaged.
Right, right.
And you can see, did this actually look in print like what you think it looks like on the screen?
And sometimes it doesn't. I had situations like that where we had author photographs inside. Sometimes they were too dark. Sometimes they weren't cropped properly. You just don't know. Those things can happen. And then yes, there were situations where we had to, I think it was, can't remember which volume it was, but there was one of the volumes where when I saw the pre-order proof, it wasn't right, and we had
Mhm.
to make some changes and then send it back. And so it was a good thing, and then order another proof to make sure that that one was right, right?
Right, yeah.
So yeah, and it takes a while for the proof to be mailed to you and everything else. So you do have to build sufficient time into the process, which, as you said, was one of the issues. We always felt like we were sort of under the gun with getting things ready. Probably we could have, should have given ourselves a little more time, but we were trying to put out one volume per year. So,
Yeah.
that was the way it worked.
And maybe because we're almost out of time, that'll be how I will wrap, at least in terms of my advice for people who are looking to self-publish, is build in maybe twice the amount of time you think you need,
Yeah.
especially if you are doing, I'm going to say, the responsible thing for your own work, which
Yeah.
is, or, having a professional cover artist, having an editor who might fall behind. If you are, like we were, working with multiple authors, I edited people's stories as they came in. I always told them, first come, first serve. You get more of my time if you come back to me earlier before deadlines. But editors get behind, publishing gets behind. It's a whole process you should plan more time for. And we did. We did actually plan in those buffers.
Yeah, we did. People get sick, lots of things happen, right? Life happens. The only thing I would say to wrap up my end was that it was a wonderful process in the end. It was so much fun. We have 3 volumes that I'm very proud of. I think they're all excellent, individual stories and as volumes. I like the fact that we have a series. It's built some interest and some momentum. And it was just fun meeting and working with all of these great time travel authors. So I would recommend that if somebody has an interest in doing this, go for it. Just listen to, what Kiersten just said about, giving yourself some time and making sure that you can bring it home, when you intend to.
Thank you, Josh, so much for doing this. It's really fun always to talk with you.
Yeah, same. Thanks, Kiersten.
And thank you to all of our viewers. Please like and subscribe this video. Check out the links below. I will put my link, Josh's link, the link to all of our books, the anthology, the link to the Gathering of the Accidental Time Travelers if you would like to meet some of those authors. Thank you so much. Have a great day.